Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third session of NNClimate21, our virtual climate conference. As I said, this is the third and final session of what has been a really stimulating day so far. And for this session, we are going to be looking at celebrating and nurturing our environment with 4 speakers who are involved in projects such as rewilding, and tree planting and looking after our woodlands as well. So it is going to be another fantastic session, I'm sure, that will again provoke thoughts, be really interesting and demonstrate the work going on locally to look after our beautiful environment. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker, which is Garratt, who's going to be talking to us about the Bulwick and Harringworth Estate Wilding project. So over to you, Graham.
Thank you very much. Ben, if I could have my first slide up, please. Okay, that's not the first slide. There we go. Right. Okay. So we've had a preview, but good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to make this presentation, which is going to be a nice, easy slideshow to start the afternoon session off. It's about the Bulwick and embryonic rewilding project that we're doing at the Bulwick and Harringworth Estate, which is synonymous within this presentation for Bulwick Estates. And it's been jointly prepared with Rupert Conant of Bulwick Estates. So the presentation is going to run through a little bit of background about the estate and its location and extent. I'm going to introduce us to our wilding vision and then take us through some of the work we're currently doing in planning and designing the project, and finishing with some input we're getting from some of our partners. So next slide, please. Okay. That's not the slide. Right, so some information missing off this slide, but Bulwick Estates is situated to the north of Corby. It's about 4,000 acres. And as Corby expands to the north through Priors Hall, it's almost a stepping stone now between Corby and the Welland Valley and the Forestry Commission's holdings further to the north at Wakeley and Fineshade. Next slide, please. And on the estate itself, the estate extends in the east from Bulwick Hall and Bulwick Park and the village of Bulwick, all running along the Welland Brook, which is in the River Nen catchment. Next slide, please. All the way through an elevated Rockingham Forest landscape to the village of Harringworth and the Welland Valley right up to the border of Rutland. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think some of the imagery has been lost from these slides. It should show the estate boundary, but roughly speaking, we can see in the bottom right-hand corner, Bulwick Park in that sort of meander of the A43, which cut through the park in the 1980s. The estate then extends up in a northwesterly direction through the belt of woodland, and then you can see the marker for Spanhoe Lodge. That's adjacent to Spanhoe Airfield, which brings the estate up to a border with the Forestry Commission's holdings at Wakeley Woods. And then it drops down into the Welland Valley to the River Welland and surrounds Harringworth. Next slide, please. And the estate has an ancient history. This is a slide illustrating Harringworth Lodge, which is at the centre of the estate. It's a Tudor hunting lodge, which was associated with an older medieval deer park, which was created in the reign of Edward I and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. And the estate itself has been in a family, in the Conant family and their ancestors, the Tryon family, since the early 1600s, since the reign of James I. And is currently owned and managed by Rupert Conant. Next slide, please. And it's in a traditional estate. made up of a mixed landscape with many trees and hedgerows and areas of beauty. And it has about 900 acres of pasture and meadow. And the whole of the 4,000 acres of the estate, about 3,100 is managed directly by the estate. Next slide, please. But it's also a hard-working farming business, working hard to feed the nation with a serious arable business. Next slide, please. With approximately another 1,700 acres subject to state-of-the-art commercial arable farming. And for reference here, you can see that the Welland Valley or Harriet Viaduct and then Seaton Church in the distance. Next slide, please. The estate also has about 200 hectares of woodland, so about 500 acres. Most of this woodland is ancient, and we've been managing it for decades now. I think I skipped over in the introduction that I work for the estate as their forestry advisor, so forestry consultant. And I've been doing that since 1998. We produce sustainably produced timber, which is mainly sold away from the estate, but we also produce an annual crop of wood fuel material, which is used in the estate's wood chip boilers, producing near carbon neutral heat for the main properties on the estate. And the woods also form the heart of the wildlife enhancement activities that we're engaged with. But it's not always been so idyllic. Next slide, please. This slide illustrates that during the 20th century, as with many areas surrounding Corby, a large part of the estate, hundreds of acres in fact, were transformed through open cast ironstone quarrying to feed the steel works at Corby. Next slide, please. And this has left us a landscape legacy, and there's been extensive loss of ancient woodland, productive farmland, and historical buildings. The topography has been changed, and the soil has been degraded, and the drainage has also been altered. And today we've got quite an open landscape in many areas, with small, isolated, and quite incongruous forestry plantations, quite different to how the landscape would have been. And this area is really quite poor for farming due to those changes to drainage and soil, but it does have a high potential value for wildlife. Next slide, please. So back in 2019, Rupert and I were thinking about the woods in particular, but we also noticed, we're looking at some of our grade scrub. The cattle here in the distance, but they're normally, or quite often, within this hawthorn area of quarryland. And we started to think, well, this area doesn't look an awful lot different to, next slide, please, this area. But the area, the photograph we're now looking at, is a photograph that I took the following year, and it's on the world famous Knepp estate in East Sussex. Next slide, please. Which is Britain's leading, or one of Britain's leading rewilding projects, certainly the most famous project, I think, in lowland Britain. And like Bulwick, the Knepp estate is a private estate which changed its farming practices back in around about the year 2000. And it moved away from intensive arable farming to extensive livestock, simply because it couldn't make the arable business commercially viable. Next slide, please. And in doing so, it developed a much more wild, nature-rich landscape. And that's allowed it to develop a local, low-impact ecotourism business. And sources of income are illustrated here from their website. So they've got different forms of accommodation, such as glamping tents and shepherd's huts and tree houses. But there was also commercial activity in visitors for safaris, looking at wildlife, and in here we're looking at the ponies, but people paying to visit the estate, also educational visits as well. And they're also continuing to farm, so producing a very high branded meat business, producing about 75 tonnes of meat each year. And not only has that given them a viable commercial business for the estate, but it's also supported the local economy and local businesses. And there's a couple of images here from Bulwick Village where businesses might benefit from low impact ecotourism and an uplift in visitor numbers. And this ethos of low input low impact to give environmental, economic and social benefits is very much aligns with the ethos and direction of Bulwick Estates under Rupert. Next slide, please. So by the beginning of this year, after a couple of years of going through some thought processes and questioning what we might do, the estate came up with this plan, which illustrates between 1,000 and 1,500 acres of land that could form the backbone of its own wilding project. And most of this land is that degraded ironstone quarry land. And the land I'm specifically talking about is shown in the light green and light blue colours, land that is either available now or could become available over the next 5 or 6 years. The brown areas are still the core arable farming areas, and the dark green are the core woods, most of which are ancient. Next slide, please. And with Natural England's help and funding from the Rural Payments Agency, the estate appointed a team of consultants in April of this year to undertake a 12-month-long feasibility study looking at the whole estate to look at both opportunities for wilding, but also enhancing the environmental side of its farming landscape. And the two main elements of that feasibility study are to look at and understand what we have at the moment, certainly what we have that is of value for social or ecological reasons and which might be threatened if management is changed, but also to look at what we have and what we might have from an opportunities point of view should we adopt certain management practices. Next slide, please. So a whole host of human-related values are being investigated. This slide illustrates the local landscape character. The consultants are also looking at wider landscape issues, land ownership and occupation, public access and heritage interest. Next slide, please. And this slide illustrates also a range of physical environmental factors that we're looking at. On this slide, we've got groundwater vulnerability and flood risk issues, as well as local climate, but we're also looking at geology and soils, topography, climate, a whole range of physical factors that might influence what we might do with our Rupert's land. Next slide, please. And at the heart of the project is nature. This slide illustrates some of the habitat mapping that we've been doing in some detail, looking at where our woods are, our hedges, our trees, meadows, and scrubland and other land-based assets of potential value, looking at both their extent and their current and potential condition. Next slide, please. And we've also been looking at, in a more detailed way, at certain species groups, certain taxa on the estate. So, for example, we've been looking at plants, and so far we've found 268 different species of plant, including 101 different species in the old quarry, that's in one site alone, and approaching 80 different species in several of the different ancient semi-natural woodlands that we have. We've been looking at reptiles, although this year, due to the weather conditions back in the spring, it's been a difficult year to survey for reptiles, but we certainly have populations of grass snake and common lizard, and we're still looking hard to see whether we've got adder. We found that we've got 30 species of butterfly, and 104 species of bird have been noted on the estate so far, over 70 of which are thought to be breeding. And we're still waiting on information to do with bats and overwintering birds. And it's worth bearing in mind that this is a snapshot. But, at the moment, these are certain sort of one-off or programs of investigation, and it's quite possible that over the years to come, that we'll find more species that are present, both as indicators of what we've got and the potential of what we could have, things that we need to protect, as well as things that we could encourage. Next slide, please. And we're also interested in history and heritage, and there's a special project. We've been looking at Bulwick Park, the consultants have. Next slide, please. Both its history, its current condition, and how it might be future managed to enhance the condition and secure that heritage value more widely. Next slide, please. The main way that we're going to manage our rewilding land, or wilding land, I should term, is through herbivory, how it's grazed and browsed. That's going to be our main tool. And that's going to be both through wild animals and domesticated animals, replicating ecological processes of animals that have been lost from our landscape over the last centuries and millennia. And so we've also engaged the Rare Breed Survival Trust to give us advice on what our land can do and what animals were best placed to deliver those ecological functions, but also how we might manage those lands or manage those species or the ones appropriate as a high brand sustainable livestock business. Next slide, please. And outside of the core feasibility study team, we've also engaged with a number of partner organisations, notably the Butterfly Conservation through what was then their Back from the Brink team at Fineshade. And they've provided us with additional information on butterflies. We've undertaken separate moth trapping, and I've come up with an incredible 421 different species so far in the estate. And they've given us additional reptile support. Next slide, please. And we've also been very lucky that the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire have been running a DEFRA-funded ELMS test and trial project, and they've used the estate to undertake a habitats-based natural capital and opportunities mapping exercise. So again, giving us information about things that we can do and things that we have to enhance the estate's performance of things such as water flow, water quality, carbon sequestration and other environmental services and natural capital. Next slide, please. And a significant opportunity for the project is to improve water and wetland features. And we've engaged with the Welland Rivers Trust to look at on-site features that we've had, but also to open a discussion about a wider landscape project within the Welland Valley floodplain. Next slide, please. So just quickly wrapping up, we're now at the stage of concluding our evidence collection, which is evaluation, and going through an analysis stage. We'll then be moving over the coming months to master planning, and then in the new year, a programme of stakeholder engagement before working with Natural England in summer of 2022 to make a countryside stewardship application, and then going live in 2023. We're also interested in looking at other opportunities such as biodiversity offsetting and net gain, particularly given the expansion agenda for Corby and the historic and physical connections between the estate and the town. And we're looking to build up a local community of advisors and volunteers and also make connections with the educational sector. Next slide, please. That brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'd like to thank those organisations that are engaged so far in helping with the project, and those that have helped provide images for using in this presentation. I look forward to any questions people might have at the panel stage later on this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham, for talking us through there what the Bulwick estate is doing, which is another really important area of our response to climate change, and looking after the environment is what private estates are doing with their land. And it was really good to hear about the rewilding approaches and the different ways that you can go about that in terms of managing the land through more natural techniques. Which certainly isn't something that you come across every day. So it's good to have that being looked at on our doorstep. The growth of ecotourism is something you also touched on, which again is really important. And at the opening of the conference, Councillor Smithers talked about how the changes that we make will be not only good for the planet or better for the planet, but also better in other ways, for example, for our well-being and for the economy in the same ways. So thank you very much, Graham. Now going to hand over to Rebecca Jenkins, who's going to talk to us about the Corby Woodland project.
Good afternoon, everybody. Ben, if I could have my first slide, please. Thank you. So my name's Rebecca Jenkins. I'm the Woodland Manager for Northamptonshire Council, and I've been asked here today to talk to you about the Corby Woodland project. I wanted to start off with a quote. This quote is particularly relevant as the Woodland project is first and foremost a great example of social forestry. A quote by Sir David Attenborough: "We all have a responsibility to care for our blue planet. The future of humanity, and indeed all life on Earth, now depends on us." As I've said, the Woodland Project is a community initiative whereby we encourage residents and visitors to use our green spaces in Corby in a positive way. Next slide, please. So where did we all begin? So it was in 2007 when local residents and councillors from the then Corby Borough Council had an aspiration to enhance and manage hazel and thuricell woods as the green heart of Corby. I'll come back to the green heart in a moment. But hazel and thuricell woods is an ancient woodland, 75 hectares. It's actually the largest ancient woodland in the UK in an urban area. And at the time was severely neglected and undermanaged. Luckily, through Section 106 funding from the Corby swimming pool and the Corby Cube developments, we obtained the necessary funding to get this project underway. At the time, as you can see from the picture there on the left, there were high levels of fly tipping and litter. There were high levels of antisocial behaviour. The local perception was that it was a no-go area. It was deemed unsafe, unwelcoming. There was very limited ecology and biodiversity and very underutilised for all of those reasons. Pathways were overgrown and in disrepair. The woodland was lacking management and we were rapidly losing a valuable ancient woodland. Next slide, please. So just want to touch upon some of the outcomes from the project. Firstly, the environmental outcomes. Since the project founded, we've identified 25 veteran trees, which are currently being protected from competing tree growth. This is achieved through our team of Parks and Woodland Rangers and our volunteers. We are actively managing our deadwood habitat and creating our habitat. We have an extensive coppicing and thinning programme. Rotational coppice management is undertaken to provide diverse habitats for a range of wildlife. Oak and hazel areas are coppiced on a 10-year rotation plan. This is producing coppice products, and ash and sallow are being coppiced on a 20-year rotation plan to produce firewood for our social enterprise programme, which I'll touch upon later. We get funding through the Forestry Commission's Countryside Stewardship Scheme to currently undertake those operations, and they are obviously within our Woodland Management Plan, which is a current 10-year plan. Annually, we plant over 2,000 whips across all of our sites, not just in hazel and thuricell woods. Those whips are sourced locally and are locally native species, and I'll talk more about tree planting in a moment. We have active ride management, which is improving access, improving that feeling of security for our users. It's improving the welcoming atmosphere and obviously the grassland habitat. We've got a scheduled monument on site. The Gartree Road, the remnants of the Roman Road, is running along Hazelwood alongside Westcott Way in Corby. And as part of our work with the English Heritage, we looked at some clearance work in 2018, and we obtained some local business involvement whereby 4 or 5 businesses came out to volunteer their time to help with the clearance work. You can find more information on that heritage monument on our interpretation boards if you take a walk around through the site. Next slide, please. We've also achieved some infrastructure outcomes. So going back to the pathways that are in disrepair, we've now installed over 6 miles of inclusive pathways and lighting. The main primary pathway is Pat Fawcett Way, which runs from the Corby Swimming Cube down to the Boating Lake. That's lit by 29 robust lighting pods, again, improving that feeling of security. We now have hundreds of people using that pathway every day, linking the residential areas to the town centre. We've also installed 3 walking trails throughout the woodlands, all of varying distances, all accessible to all. As I mentioned earlier, we have interpretation boards displaying the historic content of the site, and we've got improved signage throughout, directional signage throughout. We regularly engage with 50% of Corby schools. I started my career with Corby Borough Council at the time as the Forest School Officer. So we regularly do Forest School activities on the site. We also run our Muddy Monday programme. We believe that through education, we can really teach our young people on how to connect with their green spaces in a positive way. Back in 2010, we removed 26 tonnes of litter from hazel and thurocell woods alone through a 10-week deep clean operation. Unfortunately, this is still an issue. Litter and fly tipping in particular is still an issue in any woodland or green space. Just last month alone, our volunteers removed 400 bags of litter. And without our volunteers and without our parks and woodland rangers, we really wouldn't be able to keep on top of it. So, a huge thank you goes to those involved. And as such, we're now a green flag site and have been since 2013. We've managed to retain it year on year, and that bottom photograph shows the most recent Green Flag Award photograph from just over a month ago. We've also been recognised nationally from the Royal Forestry Society Awards and the Green Apple Gold National Award for our recognition of social forestry in terms of community engagement. Next slide, please. So again, touching on the social outcomes, we really wouldn't be where we are today without our volunteers. It's first and foremost, and most importantly, a social forestry project. We have 80 regular volunteers on a weekly basis supporting across all of our sites in Corby, and I'll touch upon those other sites shortly. So not just in hazel and thurocell woods, all giving their time to help us deliver those management outcomes for those sites. It's a whole community initiative. We also have 6 brilliant friends of groups across Corby, all looking after their local spaces. And as I mentioned earlier, we regularly engage with schools. We all know the benefits of being outdoors and being involved in a project such as this. The health and well-being, it's an active green gym, you don't need to pay for it. It's helping with emotional, social and mental health as well. Many of our volunteers come from a variety of different backgrounds. Many are vulnerable and they come to us as a placement to help build their self-esteem and confidence. And in return for their hard work, we try and support them where we can with training and team building opportunities. So there's just some photos of some of our fantastic volunteers at the bottom there. Next slide, please. And just touching upon the training opportunities, this is just a recap really of the last 3 years alone in terms of what we've provided in terms of training for our volunteers. So First Aid at Work is a regular feature. We normally run at least 1 or 2 per year for all new volunteers. For our regulated and competent volunteers, we also do some more higher level training, such as chainsaw, cross-cutting and felling qualifications, brush cutting, strimmers. We also do some basic courses, such as tree identification. We've done hedge laying courses. And most recently, we've invited Frog Life to do a reptile identification course with our volunteers. That took place over the summer. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the other sites. So as you can see, the Green Heart is there in the middle of the Corby, thurocell and hazel woods. We also have another ancient woodland, Kingswood, within Corby, a local nature reserve, which is also managed with ourselves with the Wildlife Trust. We have East Carlton Countryside Park there on the left, West Glebe Park, and our SSSI site, Weldon Woodland Park. And the Woodland Project is involved in helping with the management of all of those sites. Next slide, please. We were able to expand our work through another tranche of Section 106 funding, this time from the Geddington Road development. I must say that all of the Woodland Project's activities is funded externally through Section 106 funding at the moment. And there is a clear strategy for all of those sites. We want to increase the biodiversity value of the woodland through habitat management. We have focused thinning operations of ash and sallow and specific underplanting operations, which hopefully will ensure the woodland resilience to the effects of pests, disease and climate change. The woodland canopies of both hazel and thurocell and Kingswood are largely ash and oak. So we're looking at planting some other locally native species such as silver birch, wild cherry, hornbeam and beech to help improve that resilience. We want to provide safe, interesting and diverse opportunities for all. Again, going back to that positive engagement with local communities using their green spaces. And of course, we want to retain that green flag status. Next slide, please. So continuing on with management strategies, we are very clear that social engagement is a priority, as well as the conservation side of the woodlands and the parks themselves. We really want to encourage a deep sense of understanding, ownership and familiarity within the community, and build on that high quality volunteering programme that we've built we've tried so hard to build over the last 10 years. We also want to conserve and foster an understanding of the heritage and archaeology. Interpretation materials have been installed across all of the sites now, not just Hazel and Thurasell, which are communicating the local heritage of our green spaces. We're also promoting the use of wooden projects in traditional craft techniques, for example, through hedge lane courses and walking stick making. All coppiced material that's extracted from our woodlands is split and seasoned on our local field. This is then sold when ready for firewood within our woodland shop, which I'll talk about shortly. All of the revenue generated is going back into that project to help sustain the project go further. Next slide, please. So just some of the achievements, and this is only some because we've got many from the past 10 years. I'm now pleased to announce that East Carlton Countryside Park is also a Green Flag Award winner this year. And obviously we're working very hard to retain that status. A huge thank you to all the volunteers, the staff at the park and our Parks and Woodland Rangers for making that happen. Again, without them, it simply wouldn't be possible. We now have active working woodland management plans for Kingswood Local Nature Reserve, Great Oakley Meadow, East Carlton, as well as obviously Hazel and Thurasell Woods. This is so vitally important to make sure that operationally we are delivering on the ground what is needed for those specific sites. They are bespoke, they are tailored specifically to those sites. We work in very close partnership with the Forestry Commission, with the Wildlife Trust and local consultants to ensure that the best management plans are in place. And again, they're working documents and are reviewed regularly. We have recently launched the Corby Heritage Cycle Trail. So this will hopefully connect with the Greenway project that Lucy Hawes was talking about earlier, and also with the River Eyes project from the RNRP. But the Corby Heritage Trail is at the moment connecting 6 green spaces across Corby. We have 5 routes across Corby that people can cycle and walk and use within their own recreational time. They're fully safe and accessible to all. And again, looking specifically at the heritage of all of those sites. So you can not only look at the boards, the interpretation boards on site, but there's a Love Exploring app that you can also use to get further information on each of those sites when necessary. In 2014, we opened Foxy's Woodland Shop. This is based at East Carlton Countryside Park and was vital in terms of how we were going to become self-sustainable, looking at how we were going to produce our own income to be able to protect the project once the Section 106 funding ceased. We have a lovely shop. Please go and see it if you haven't already. We sell lots of lovely items in there, obviously the firewood sales as well. And again, all profit from that shop goes back into the Woodland project, and that's spent across all of the green spaces at the moment across Corby. Another achievement is obviously, I keep saying it, but it has to be the volunteers, that high quality volunteering programme, which includes all of the 6 Friends of groups across Corby, as well as those individuals that just give their time as and when they can. We have our annual winter tree planting programme with Carbon Footprints. They're a matchmaking company, that's the best way I can describe it, between local businesses that want to reduce their carbon footprints by planting trees, and they matchmake them with local placements that can actually plant them for them, such as ourselves. This year alone, we've got 2,700 whips for 2021, and we'll be doing a lot more next year in conjunction with the Queen's Green Canopy. We've also engaged a lot of local business involvement. So not just individuals from the local community, but local businesses that want to connect with local projects, volunteer some time. They've been helping us with our coppicing programme, as have departments from North Northamptonshire Council. And it's a great way to reconnect your teams. Next slide, please. So what's next for the future? We have a nice project that we're hoping to launch next year. We're hoping to grow our own community tree nursery and our food growing hub. Again, looking at that self-sufficiency. So the food grown in the hub will be vegetables and plants that will be eventually sold within the Woodland shop. We're also going to have a community initiative where we provide food boxes for the local community from a central location. And we will be growing our own locally sourced whips through the community tree nursery in the hope that we can transplant those back into our green spaces. I mentioned the River Eyes project earlier. We're working in collaboration with them to try and link the cycle networks across the north, including the Corby heritage cycle trails that are already in existence. We would like to build on those team building opportunities and engage even more people within our projects, looking at corporate team building events, as well as those events that are free through our coppicing programme. Everybody's welcome, and hopefully my details will be posted at the end of this event, and people can get in touch if they would like to discuss that further. Most excitingly, we are looking at replicating the great work that's already happened across now North Northamptonshire. Through North Northamptonshire Council, we've got a great opportunity to broaden our horizons, widen our remit, look at those pockets of ancient woodland in particular that are under our ownership, and potentially recreate the Woodland project elsewhere, look at recreating or producing new friends of groups for different areas across the north, and always looking at that long-term sustainability, how we can really make this project self-sufficient so that we are protecting our green spaces and woodlands for many years to come for future generations. That's the end of my presentation. I'd just like to say a big thank you to all of the staff and all of the volunteers that are involved in the project. I know that they'll be either listening now or later on, and honestly, without them, it just wouldn't be possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. That was a great presentation again. And to reiterate what you said, the volunteers are instrumental in this, and a big thank you to all of them for all their work. I was really pleased to get down to the country parks in Corby recently and see the work going on, and just how important it is to local people as well, which is great. It's also really good to hear of the opportunities for developing out and expanding on the best practice and the great work that we've got going on across North Northamptonshire. And that's one of the opportunities that we have now we've come together as a larger unitary council. So I'm sure we'll all be interested to see the progress of that and get involved in the future. Now going to hand over to Kathryn Hardcastle, who's going to talk to us about building local resilience to climate change. And she comes from the Rewilding Regional Park.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here with you. And thank you for the invitation. You can start my slides, please, Ben. We've heard so much today. I'm sure all of you that are listening are feeling more than a little overwhelmed in terms of the incredible work that is underway and being delivered across our very precious area. Next slide, please, Ben. I chose not to focus on projects that RNRP has been involved with historically. I'll cover some of that at the beginning of my presentation, but I instead wanted to take a bit of a forward look. I know that there is a tremendous appetite for action on climate change. And while there are things which are beyond the reach of all of us, there are certainly things that anybody can do that will contribute towards the betterment of our environment and our response to climate change. So I'll talk a little bit about the climate crises. We heard earlier today from Chris Holt about what our climate might look like. I'll introduce a bigger picture and talk about adaptation as well as mitigation, and then finish by providing a helpful framework for how we might think about climate change and the way that we respond to that, along with some examples from elsewhere. Thanks, Ben. Next slide. So I am the Chief Exec at Rewilding Regional Park. I've been in post since 2013. We were established as a community interest company way back in 2004 with a very strong remit and focus on the natural environment, and in particular green infrastructure. In fact, I believe our NRP, prior to me joining them, were one of the pioneers of approaches around green infrastructure. We're independent and private, not for profit, and we deliver sustainable outcomes principally through partnership working. So very little of what we accomplish and what we do is done in isolation. We work very closely with multiple other organisations you've heard us referred to already several times today. And importantly, we also work with local community groups. We cover an area that stretches across the entirety of the valley, from Daventry to Peterborough. We're a very small team. There are 6 of us, 2 of whom are part-time, and we're supported by some extraordinary small consultancies, and most recently by a team of enthusiastic young trainees through the Kickstarter programme. In the time that we've existed, we've managed to bring in more than £30 million of investment to the area, and we've been involved with some very large and iconic projects. But we do work at multiple scales, everything from individual back gardens and pocket parks all the way up to broad landscape projects, including the NNClimate scheme, which was referred to by Lucy earlier, which is 1 more year to run. Thanks, Ben. However, we are poised to make something of a change as an organisation. So Rewilding Regional Park, as I said, has been around for a very long time. And over that time, our focus has changed a little bit. So we've been involved for a long time with the catchment-based approach, focusing around the Nen and its tributaries, and doing a lot of work around restoring the river and supporting flood reduction and flood mitigation measures, etc. So we are in the process now of transferring our registration from Companies House to the Charities Commission, and we hope that early in the new year we'll be announcing our new identity as the Nen Rivers Trust, and we will formally join the Rivers Trust network. Along with that transition will come a very small change in focus. So we will obviously continue to be working on our climate we will obviously be continuing to work on our environmental improvement initiatives and on supporting communities in accessing our environmental assets, but we will take a very direct focus on climate change, and we really want to work with local communities and local businesses around supporting them in climate adaptation. Next slide, please. Someone far wiser than me said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And while we've been involved in mitigation efforts for a very long time, Chris pointed out this morning that even with the best of efforts, even with the best of all possible outcomes from COP26 and the 25 which preceded it, we have a lot of climate change baked into the system. And so we still need to be contemplating adaptation. Next slide, please. Chris covered this off in a great deal of detail earlier today, so I don't need to talk about what the specific climate changes will be that we will need to be addressing, but they're just listed there for information. So Chris talked about some of the weather impacts. Along with that, we can expect to see food shortages. We can expect to see some climate migration. While things become increasingly uncomfortable for us, they will for others elsewhere as well. And also rising levels of climate anxiety and mental health impacts that go along with uncertainty or a lack of agency, if you like. Next slide, please. It's not just climate change that we're facing into, though. It's apparent for anybody watching and paying attention to the news that extreme weather events are on the rise. Everyone is also aware, and thanks to the great work of incredible spokespeople such as David Attenborough, we know that our biodiversity and ecosystems are in some places under collapse. There's evidence linking our environmental degradation and climate change to the rise in the incidence of zoonotic diseases such as COVID-19. We're already beginning to feel some economic fragility, and we might anticipate that that will continue into the future. We'll likely experience increasing social injustice, resource depletion, crisis of meaning, and disconnection and polarization. All paints a pretty dire picture. So, next slide, please. The first thing I invite you to do is breathe. We've heard a lot about the incredible efforts that are already underway. And it may feel overwhelming, but we're here now and there are things that we can all be doing. Next slide, please. So we hear a lot from governments about net zero. We've heard a lot today about emphasis on mitigation, but climate adaptation mustn't be forgotten. And so there's an example here that I borrowed from a very dear friend who says, if you imagine a car that's racing towards a brick wall that's far too fast and won't stop in time, there are two primary tools that the driver has at their disposal. There's the brakes, which slow the car down, and then there are the airbags, which cushion the passengers when the crash happens. Mitigation is the brakes. It slows climate change and reduces the overall magnitude of that change with lots of effort. Adaptation is the airbags. It might protect and cushion people and nature somewhat as climate change progresses. And we absolutely need both of those things, and at scale. Next slide, please. We've heard here lots of examples of adaptation in action already. The work that's going on around the charging points for electric vehicles, access to electric scooters, the work that's happening at the Chelvaston site, and some examples here about adaptation, the burying power lines so that we reduce the impacts of storms, purchasing emergency generators that will allow us to continue to fuel and heat ourselves when power is interrupted, local projects for energy and water provision, preparing our buildings for higher temperatures, for higher rainfalls, landscape management for flooding and heat, which is a lot of the work that we do within our NRP contributes to those elements, updating our emergency measures plans, and more local food production. I added a little footnote at the bottom there, just to bring your attention or invite you to consider that adaptation must include a consideration of social justice. Those of us who are privileged and lucky enough to have resources will find it easy to make some of these adjustments. But there are those amongst us who will not have those opportunities. And so it's important that we consider that when making choices for the future. Next slide, please. And so I borrowed a quote from Professor Jem Bendell, who is a professor of sustainability at Cumbria University. This quote comes from a paper that Jem wrote in 2018, in which he points out that millions of people are already suffering, and it's worse than we've been told. We are in danger and must do what we can to try and slow the problems down, but we must also do all that we can to help each other through this. Next slide, please. I popped in a cartoon to lighten the mood a little bit, but I often hear this in conversation with my professional peers and with my community. What can I do? I'll never be able to do enough to make an impact. Or frustration at governments and our leaders for the pace at which they are able to move. And it's entirely true. If we wait for the government, it will be too late. And if we each of us act as individuals, perhaps it will be too little. But if we work as communities, it might just be enough. And so much of what we've already heard today, and indeed this initiative from the council in bringing people together to talk about it, is exactly this. It's us coming together to work as communities. Next slide, please. So I said at the beginning of the talk that I wanted to focus, rather than focusing on the work that RNRP has done and that we will continue to do into the future, I wanted to take a bit of a forward look and invite all of you who are listening, both now live and a bit later on, to think about the things that you can do with support from us at RNRP and others to adapt to the changes that are ahead of us. And so I'm providing an offering for your consideration, this framework, which is called the 4R framework, and again, is drawn from the work of Professor Jen Bendell at the University of Cumbria. And the invitation is for 4 questions. So to think about this in terms of resilience, what is it that we really value and how do we keep it? How do we build and sustain resilience within ourselves and our communities? What's most important? The second question is a question of relinquishment. And so I heard a lot of talk earlier in the conference about the kinds of things that people might give up. So using their car less frequently, or not traveling so often, or converting to electric vehicles if you're lucky enough to be resourced to do that. So the second question is about what can we give up in order not to make matters worse or to slow that climate change trajectory. The next question is about restoration. What can we bring back that has been lost? And again, we've heard stories of that in the conference today, the rewilding projects, planting of woodlands, habitats that have been lost or perhaps broken and dismantled and that could be reconnected. But there are also habits from our past that we might want to consider. More local food production. I know repair cafes are popping up around the country, supporting people in reusing their broken and repurposing their broken property. And then the final question is one of reconciliation and reconnection. What do we do to make peace with, love and support others? The challenges ahead will be difficult, but you've heard a great deal today from people who are working hard in partnership to deliver really positive outcomes. And so this question is about how do we make peace and work with others in order to make a big difference. And I just wanted to finish off with some examples, perhaps of inspiration, of how other communities, small and large, and individuals have responded to these 4 questions and the ways in which we might be able to support you in addressing these questions for yourself. Next slide, please, Ben. So in response to the questions of resilience, here are some of the responses that we've collected or heard from other communities and from work being done in those places. Efforts to build local community, working on personal health and fitness, reducing debt, organising for local access and even community ownership of water, food, energy, waste management. Chelvaston is a fantastic example of decentralising those some of the key services. Growing food and reducing food waste and composting our biodegradable materials, reducing, reusing, recycling and repurposing, repairing, reducing water consumption. We heard earlier about drought becoming perhaps more of a problem for us through the summer months. Finding their tribes. So people talked about creating relationships, getting to know their neighbours, community swap shops and the gift economy, citizens' assemblies for decision-making at local levels, learning about and reducing individual carbon footprints, etc. And then some comments around reintroducing the art of storytelling, art and poetry and shared ritual, which we've all seemed to have become far too busy for in recent years. Next slide, please, Ben. Some of the things people had said they would be happy to give up or that they wanted to consider in terms of reducing their personal impact was eating out of season food and flying and unsustainable tourism. So perhaps we'll see more people capitalising on our incredible environment and staying close to home for their recreation and rest. Some people advocate for giving up meat and animal products. Some people advocate reducing our consumption and this idea of infinite economic growth. Some people have advocated for giving up personal vehicles and joining car clubs or making use of short-term rental cars or bicycles, etc. So yeah, there's some examples there about things that other communities have have talked about relinquishing as they face into climate adaptation. Next slide, please. In terms of restoration, well, we've heard a lot of this today, and indeed these are projects that we work on a lot within the Rewilding Regional Park. So rewilding and regenerative agriculture, we do a lot of work with local farmers. We're involved with Lucy via the Greenway, and indeed a new pathway along the length of the Eyes from Corby connecting. So providing opportunities for people to walk, run and cycle. And that you'll see other examples there of what people want to bring back into their lives, connecting with nature. So the rewilding projects, which will allow people to immerse themselves more fully. Community living and food growing and eating. So this idea of shared allotment spaces and community orchards, etc., are all things that people elsewhere had identified as having value. Next one. Next slide, thank you. Reconciliation. So people elsewhere have put forward these kinds of ideas. Intergenerational dialogue, making beauty and acts of art, practicing curiosity and compassion for other views and opinions, and a shift in focus from me to we. And then my last slide, please. So how might Rewilding Regional Park or the Neem Rivers Trust contribute to this as our new entity? Well, we'll be continuing with our environmental restoration efforts and projects and working with farmers and others around regenerative agriculture, implementing nature-based solutions for reducing flood incidents and flood impacts. But we'd also be interested in working with communities to convene and facilitate meetings to discuss some of these challenging issues. We can probably support you with access to information and connections to helpful agents and sources of funding to support endeavour. It's something we've built something of a skills bank in recent years. We can certainly support with the design and delivery of local projects to enhance the environment and with the implementation of nature-based solutions to build resilience. And I realised that earlier in my presentation, I probably got a little bit heavy in pointing at the scale and magnitude of the predicament that we face. So I'm leaving you with that little quote, which comes from another dear friend called Kimberly Hare, who says, although there are real threats, there's also the possibility for the transition to a different kind of life and society through betterment rather than biggerment. Thank you to the conference organisers for inviting me to speak. And thank you for indulging me as I chose to take a forward look rather than to talk about the work that we'd completed thus far. And that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. That really was fascinating. And it's important to look at this for what it is and the challenge that we do face. It was really useful to be able to break down into a really understandable way the options that are in front of us and how we can tackle those practically. So that was really, really useful, I thought. Thank you very much for your time. Now going to hand over to Sarah Parr, who's from North Northamptonshire Council, who's going to be talking about rewilding and tree planting and some of the really good projects that are going on locally.
Hello, I'm Sarah Parr, and I'm the Grounds Services Manager for the Shared Service In-House Grounds Maintenance Department for North Northants. We're a team of 65 gardeners, a tree gang, and a technical office team who develop and maintain the council's vast array of green and community infrastructure. The way our team maintains North Northants' landscape is our route to tackling the climate crisis. Unfortunately, I don't have slides to show you. I will show you some pictures in a bit, but it's just me talking mostly. I am here to talk about our latest campaign, which concentrated on pollinators and rewilding. We here in Grounds, we love bees. In fact, we love all pollinators, even wasps. And the decline of these important animals has put Britain in the bottom 10% globally for biodiversity loss. We want to fight back against that and bring back these vital invertebrates to our beautiful landscape here at Northants. So I'm going to talk about these with you, and then, fingers crossed, I've been told in my ear there's a 50% chance that it might not play all the way through, but we did a little video earlier of planting some trees because we felt you couldn't really have a climate change conference and invite our grounds maintenance team to talk but we don't plant trees. So we've planted 3 trees here today at lunch. So fingers crossed you'll be able to watch that after I've done some talking and you've seen some pictures. Back to pollinators. On our mission to feed the bee, we carried out a 3-fold pollinator campaign, which, though primarily was aimed at creating more feeding sites for bees, it actually gave us a massive opportunity to provide local leadership to our residents and local businesses and schools on the way they themselves could join this vital mission. There were 3 elements to this project. There was the creation of some exotic meadows, rewilding, and the installation of our Pardon the Weeds signage. I've broken them down to 3, so I'm going to talk about those now. By far, the most striking and beautiful of those elements was the creation of 23 brand new exotic meadows, which we planted on roundabouts, on walkways, in parks and gardens, outside libraries, and various gateways into the towns that we maintain. We wanted these to offer brightly coloured feeding sites for pollinators and to give delight to our residents who were enduring at the time a horrible, depressing lockdown during the pandemic. We felt people needed an emotional boost, and we felt also the responsibility hard that the only places people were allowed to visit were our parks and gardens and streetscapes. We wanted to also show our key workers that they were not alone. We were still there working alongside them and keeping their neighbourhoods safe and beautiful. It is hard not to smile when you're faced with a blast of floral colour on your way to work. And in the office, we've been reduced to tears in a good way by some of the customer responses we've had to these new meadows, particularly those that we strategically placed where our public health facilities were and where those workers would see them. What we wanted to create was something unexpected and delightful, colourful and inspiring, and people were as much the reason we did this as was the bees. Though, like I said before, we really, really do love bees. The next element of this pollinator campaign, which I'm going to talk about now, was the rewilding of areas. This was where we aimed to create nature havens through a less intensive management approach. We focused this near hedgerows, on high-speed roads, industrial estates, and our more semi-natural parks and open spaces. This part of the project saw us mapping and creating wildlife corridors for our local wildlife. Ramping up our site-specific approach to land management, we created miles and miles of species-rich grassland and yields of meadowflowers, as well as reducing our own vehicle usage across our towns. This was closely linked with the council's asset delivery plan, and we thought by designing a delicate and responsible approach and to make sure we were considering our effects and our actions had on the natural world around us, we began to see nature taking a hold onto areas that we had, if I'm being honest, previously overmanaged. This was rewilding at its simplest, reintroducing nature into the urban landscape, bringing nature closer to people's lives. It also not only helped the pollinators, but had a knock-on effect to biodiversity and wildlife throughout our communities. Now, the final part of this project, which was the part which unexpectedly blasted it into the global arena, was the Pardon the Weeds, We Are Feeding the Bees signs. These signs were primarily aimed, I'm going to show you some pictures in a moment, these signs were primarily aimed at protecting dandelions and clover in the early flowering season when bees struggle to find pollen and are hungry. The initial idea was that if any of our team saw a verge that was more flower than grass, is to leave it banging one of these signs, and it would be left and we wouldn't mow it. I still have had, and I have had for the last 2 years, just a boot full of these signs and a sledgehammer in my car, and I just pull over if I see something interesting and bang one of these signs in, and then it will be protected from our mowing kit. We wanted to take advantage of the diversity in verge grassland to release what was already in place in these fascinating seed banks throughout our towns. Often verges are a key to see what historically was on a site before it was developed. With the photos, you can just keep them rolling. That's absolutely not in any particular order. So whoever's got the button for the photos, just keep them rolling. So overpowering ryegrasses are rarely used in these linear small green areas. So when left to their own devices, a little magic can occur. And then what we created were feeding stations for bees with little effort. Public opinions have changed on verge maintenance. We are incredibly lucky to have picked our timing for this project when very environmentally savvy residents wanted more from us than just neat and tidy cropped verges. Councils have been missing a trick, if I'm being honest, often blaming the public for their opinion on why they continue to blanket cut verges across their areas. And what we've proven with this project was that the public are ready for something different, and they're ready for more targeted mowing. So about the public response. Shortly after the first signs were installed, a photo of one of them on a Burton Latimer industrial estate by a complimentary resident highlighting to us and explaining how he appreciated the thought went viral on Twitter. And over one weekend, this little sign that we'd banged into a verge got 16,000 likes and 5,000 retweets. During that weekend, residents all over the UK demanded via social media that their own local authorities do the same and adopt our sign for their verges. And many councils have already taken this idea, and it has been implemented throughout the country. And not only this, but other countries have got involved. Other countries such as Australia, Indonesia, Brazil, the Czech Republic have all recognised this project. And in Canada, we've linked up with the city Belleville, and they have created their own rewilding areas using our signs in their parks, which was really, really, really quite exciting. The sign has now been retweeted and congratulated by Greenpeace, Chris Packham, and oddly Bette Midler. And in the following months, it was seen posted by different social media outlets hundreds of thousands of times. It was spotted on Facebook, being posted by an environmental group, and it had, at that point, 500,000 likes. It's got gold for environmental best practice and a Bees Needs Award for providing food and a home for pollinating insects. We knew when we started the sign installation that it would be popular. We felt an excitement in the office when the signs come back to the printers. We thought locally, but actually acted globally. And it's these types of initiatives that really do show how much councils can and should do on their own land to fight the climate crisis. The whole pollinator campaign saw 21 more miles of species-rich grassland and floral meadows being created across Northants land. But it really was a response from the public which made it feel so epic. We never imagined what an effect a decision made by just a grounds maintenance department could touch and reach so many people. The increased well-being caused by our mission just to feed the bee and other pollinators has astounded us and inspired our next campaign, which is to focus on people's well-being in nature and what we can do as a grounds team to contribute to people's day-to-day and mental health. we're putting happiness at the centre, and on the recovery of our neighbourhoods, hopefully coming out of the horrid COVID period, we're hoping to bring more colour, more bees, more nature, and more lifting of people's spirits on their way to work. As large landowners, councils need to change how they do things. With rewilding gaining momentum, councils need to choose not whether they bring nature back into their landscape, but where are they going to bring nature back into their landscape. Picking the right site and ensuring at the same time that other areas are still kept pristine and well managed is how the public will adjust. They are ready to see things change, but they don't want to see a loss of formal bedding displays in towns or sports pitches not being highly managed. They don't want to replace those things. They want both, and it's this diversity in the landscape which needs to be designed into council's green infrastructure. We've shown this with our site-specific approach to land management, that the public are ready, and that there's definitely room for it. Okay, if we just turn off the pictures now and come back to me. Hi. I've also been asked to talk about tree planting on North Northants land and what our plans are for the Queen's Green Canopy campaign. I'd like to mention our Woodlands and our country parks teams are planting thousands of whips this planting season with support from their rangers, where the public can attend and plant a tree at these really special sites. We've also put some sites buying Kettering for this, and if you'd like to get involved in any community tree planting events, there's a lot going on at North Northants. We saw this year, we applied for a bid for some external funding through the Treescapes Fund, which we were successful, and we'll be planting 1,040 standard trees over North Northants as well. To kick off the Queen's Green Canopy campaign, just a few hours ago, we planted 3 new street trees right here outside our depot on the verge. Street trees work harder than any other trees, and we're massive fans of them here in grounds maintenance, planting over 800 in the last 5 years. Street trees provide food, habitat, they connect the landscape for urban wildlife, and next year we'll be focusing on trees. So if you've got a verge outside your house and you'd like a tree, drop us a line, and it may be a site we could use. Anyways, we're going to, fingers crossed, we're going to try and play the short film we did earlier. I'm no Michaela Strachan, so my apologies that it's a bit all over the place. Okay, fingers crossed, go for it with the video.
Work the hardest. A street tree actually absorbs 9 times more pollutants than any other tree. So they really are the workers of the tree world. They reduce toxic air mortality, and if you're walking down a street and there are street trees on it, you're breathing in half the pollutants because they act like a beautiful green barrier between the path and the road. They are a total win-win situation, and we love them. We plant a lot of street trees compared to most councils. By planting street trees, you reduce water runoff and any flooding potential of urban properties in that area. They store carbon, they provide shade, and they reduce the island effect. Really importantly is that they increase biodiversity in what sometimes would be considered a dead landscape. I'm going to walk up and show you another tree that we've planted. So we've planted 3 just here. These are all silver birches that we've put in today. They make lovely street trees. The bark peels off and they do absorb a lot of pollutants that comes out through that bark. These particular ones start off quite dark, but as it ages, it will get white whiter and whiter, and they will be ghostly looking. Really, really, really beautiful trees, silver birch. We've got the two guys that I've got here planting today are a part of our cemeteries team, and they are the reason that the Shire Lodge Cemetery looks so good. I'm going to introduce you to them now. We would normally have our tree gang doing some tree planting, but with the hurricane that happened 2 weeks ago, they are really, really busy just trying to keep everyone's neighbourhood safe still. So we're going to put the third tree. Street trees, research shows that they actually increase productivity. So if you work in an office and you look out the window and you can see a street tree, productivity is increased in those workplaces and you're less likely to phone in sick, research has shown. So we're planting them right near our street cleansing department, so they will be having a lot less time off sick due to the tree planting we've done. They have a massively positive effect on people's mental health, and are sometimes the only natural elements that people view from their homes or on their way to work or on their way to school. And this is Connor and Jay. And this is the third one going in. So that's 3 trees for the Queen's Green canopy. It's a little bit. 3 trees for the Queen's Green canopy. First ones on North Northampton soil, and you've seen it today. Okay, go.
Okay, that worked. It was a bit juddery, but it was okay. It worked. Okay, hopefully those trees will start doing their magic immediately. I hope I've described what we have been doing here in grounds for bees and tree planting. I hope I've done that adequately and with clarity. Just to finish off, the main fear of climate change is really biodiversity loss, and the implications that has for the human food chain is immediate. And our emotional connection to the earth becomes even more lost as we see these important animals decline. But I think throughout this project, we have proved that the public do want to see councils change, and that a more targeted approach to grass cutting and land management is the way forward. And that's me done. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for taking us through that. And it was brilliant to see some trees being planted there. I'm really glad the video worked. So thank you to you and your team for doing that this morning, just to show some tangible work going on. It was brilliant to hear about the Pardon the Weeds, We're Feeding Bees, which quite rightly has gained international recognition as a really great way of looking after our biodiversity. And it's something that I know we're keen to expand across North Northamptonshire further, because it just is so important that we look after all parts of the various ecosystems that give life to this planet. So it was great to find out more about that, and if people weren't aware of this project, they now are and know that it's on their doorstep, which is great too. So thank you very much. So we've come to the end of our speakers for this third and final session. We're now going to move to a Q&A. So hopefully we've had some questions come in via the email address. And then after the Q&A, we will go to the closing remarks for the day, which has been fantastic so far. So I'm going to hand over to George Cllr now to take us through that.
Thank you, Councillor Pentland. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is George Cllr. I'm Executive Director for Place and Economy here at Northamptonshire Council. Once again, an incredibly inspiring, uplifting series of presentations, but also incredibly educational too. I felt just watching all 4 of them. So thank you to Graham, Rebecca, Kat and Sarah. Fantastic. So I've got a few questions that I'm going to pose to you that have come in. Biodiversity, I think was mentioned by every single person actually on all 4 of the presentations, and the importance of that. And we've had a question that's come in from a local councillor in Corby around that. I'm going to pose this one to Kat, if I may, which is, what can local communities do to protect and further enhance and develop sort of local brooks and waterways that they might see in their local area?
Great question. Thank you, George. Brooks and waterways are a little bit complicated unless they're on public land. If they're private, if they run through private land, then they come under a piece of legislation that relates to riparian rights and responsibilities. So if you're lucky enough to own a brook, then you will have some freedom of action in terms of efforts to look after and support its development and its resilience. If it's on a public piece of land, then obviously needing to be working with the landowners, which would often be council, obviously. There's lots of things that can be done. So we can look at changing the shapes of the banks to accommodate additional water with some simple earthworks, or it could be as simple as reintroducing native riparian species, so native species of plants that would have been on those brooks before we extended our landscaping and gardening to their very fringes. There's a brilliant example of that type of work along the waterfront at Wellingborough at the moment. One of my colleagues, Victor, has installed floating platforms to hide, if you like, or the hard edging in front of what was the Whitworth Mill building, with a fabulous range of local endemic species that will be adding masses to local biodiversity. But I'm sure Sarah must come across this issue of how to manage local waterways as well. So maybe Sarah's got something she'd like to add.
Yes, Sarah, do you want to add anything further to what you've heard from Kat? No? All good? Okay. We did cover this as well, actually, in one of the earlier sessions, and the importance of biodiversity. Like I said, it's sort of a core piece of DNA, if you like, of what we need to be mindful of and undertaking in all that we do. Another question I'm going to pose to Graham, if I may, and it was fascinating hearing the work of the Bulwick and Harringworth estate and the incredible diversity and diversification, if you like, but making best use of that natural environment. And you touched on ecotourism very briefly, and obviously reference to the Knepp estate. I just wondered, is this a niche area we should be known for nationally? And if so, how do we harness that energy around the wider Northamptonshire area to make that happen?
I don't know if it's a niche area. It definitely seems to be a growing area of economic activity. When we first started thinking about wilding on the Bulwick and Harringworth estate, we did some, not opportunity mapping, but we looked at our, who our neighbours were and what they were doing. And we thought, you could engage with a very limited number of people or organisations and actually bring a lot of land into a sort of ecotourism focused activity. That was back in 2019, and then that kind of thrust has been taken on by the Rockingham Forest Vision Group, I think, which is looking to bring Heritage Lottery Fund money into the area north, really, of Corby Oundle Road. So we would hope that area would become a destination for ecotourism, both raising its environmental credentials and using that, be able to publicise that increase in environmental credentials to actually attract people in as a sustainable way as possible, to bring them in and support the local economy and communities, but also provide facilities for people that already live here. And of course, new people are coming to live here all the time as well with the expansion of the towns.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're absolutely right. It's definitely a growing area, and I think it's one that we just need to harness that energy and play and perhaps develop a wider awareness program for not just visitors, but also people living locally as well. I suppose that sort of brings me on to my next question for yourself, Rebecca, if I may, which is how do we create that wider awareness of some of the beauty that we've got on our very own doorstep? You've done that brilliantly in Corby, but how do we get that wider awareness? People tend to look further afield for some of this environmental richness. I just wondered how we go about it to ensure that we get that engagement at a real local level.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been part of our journey over the last 10 years, to almost stop people from going further afield to find those gorgeous pieces of countryside and actually look on their doorstep. And I think the last year has really helped in a lot of ways. That one of the silver linings from COVID is that actually people have been staying local. In Corby especially, we have a saying that no resident is more than a 10-minute walk from a local green space. So it's about encouraging people to look again what's on their doorstep and look at what opportunities there are to get involved. Again, going back to that community engagement, getting that buy-in and that feeling of ownership over their local green spaces. Part of what we've done with the project is allowing people to have a say in what happens through the woodland management plans, through the Friends of groups. All of those Friends of groups have not only working parties on the ground, but also monthly meetings where they meet to discuss the projects in line with what we have planned within our operational delivery. So it's really a two-way approach, looking at what we can deliver with support from local residents and what they want as well. So we do a lot of marketing, a lot of publicity, we do a lot of events, we go into the schools, we look at educational programs. I mentioned our family activities through the summer holidays. So it's just about doing more of the same really, and obviously hopefully replicating the good work across the north with those groups such as the Rockingham Vision Group, looking at partnering with key partners such as the RNRP, the Rockingham Forest, Natural England, and getting that wider message across to all. And I think the green flag as well helps with that. We've got 4 now across Northamptonshire. The grounds maintenance team have got 2 of their own as well. So I think it's all about those things coming together really to promote the fact that we have got really diverse, beautiful sites, within walking distance. You don't have to get in the car and take the kids further afield. You can just get on your bikes or just walk to them.
Absolutely, and far more environmentally friendly as well, cycling or walking to your local hive of activity, if you like. Feeding in the bee connection there, Sarah. I hope you noticed that. Another question for I sort of pose this to Graham and Kat, which is this is easy to do if you're the landowner and want to do some of these changes. And again, we've heard some great examples, but how do we engage with local landowners to become, if you like, more aware of what they can do on their own land, protecting and both enhancing the local environment? So maybe I'll put that to Graham initially, who's sort of done that, and we've heard some great examples, and then pass on to Kat.
So how do you approach them? Well, I suppose directly, I mean, separately to the Bulwick project, I'm also doing a part-time PhD looking at rewilding and forestry, and I'm interviewing private landowners in the Rockingham Forest, and it's surprising how many of them are actually very interested in this. You tend to think they're very traditional, and they're not interested in land use change, and some of them aren't, but some of them are. So either directly, or I don't know whether the council has a facility to approach people, but they're also looking to engage with people as well. The basic payment scheme, which is the central fund for farming, farming subsidies, is being phased out, and all of these estates and landowners are having to look at the commerciality of what they do now. And I think they're all expecting, or quite a few of them are expecting, things to change, and they'll do things differently. So it's almost a once in a generational opportunity to look at how they manage their land. And I think if they're interested in the rural economy and ecotourism and being in a growth area such as Northamptonshire, engaging with the wider community is potentially a really strong positive thing for them to do, rather than in the past they might not have had such a positive outlook on that sort of engagement. So find out who the landowners are and approach their estate offices and see how you get on.
Okay, simple as that. Okay, Kat, anything you wanted to add? Anything you want to add?
Yes, please. I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of that work is being done. So Graham's obviously aware of that, given the incredible work that's going on up at Bulwick. But we have a land advisor on team at Rewilding Regional Park who works actively with farmers. We have land advisors based with several of our other partner organisations, including folk like the Wildlife Trust, who are actively engaging with farmers all the time. Graham mentioned there are changes around the countryside stewardship and catchment sensitive farming type payments that come via DEFRA, via the government, all of which incentivise improvements in land management these days. And it is a pivotal time in terms of access to resources and support for farmers who want to make those changes in the way that they are utilising their lands or managing their landscape. But it's a great time because there are multiple opportunities, and with a shift towards nature-based solutions and natural capital accounting, we may even start to see private investment in these types of initiatives on privately owned farmland. So yeah, it is happening. I appreciate that if you're not part of that network, it might feel a little slow, and there are certainly examples of less good approaches, if you like, but we are very fortunate in our area in North Northampton particularly to have some very innovative farmers and landowners who are doing some very remarkable things in terms of enhancing biodiversity and reducing the impacts of their activities.
Great, that's fantastic to hear. And
George, could I just say there could be a role here for the local planning authority with the biodiversity offsetting and biodiversity net gain. We, as I work for private landowners, we'd like to know how we can engage in that agenda. And so maybe, the electorate has a role to engage with organisations such as North South Council to create mechanisms that we as landowners can then engage with from our side.
I think that's it's a very fair point, and it's certainly something that we as a council, I think, have been doing, but we probably can do more of, I think is fair to say, Graham, and obviously we're relatively new as a local authority, so I think it's a fair point to make, and for us to follow up outside of today's conference. I'm just going to close with one final question. I think you said this, Sarah, which was, I think locally, impact globally, and I think that's, I suppose, if there's one sort of catchphrase that I've taken, one statement that I sort of taken from all of the sessions today is what actually is happening on our doorstep. In some instance, some greater way, really impacting on a global scale. So I think it's incredibly inspiring and very proud to be part of Northamptonshire as an area to see what's actually going on in our geography. But I would imagine a number of people watching this conference, Sarah, will be interested to know how they can get hold of some of those signs ready for next year. So what's the best way of, for example, town and parish councils have got pieces of land, or again, as I say, other private landowners that might want to take the initiative that was started by you and your team this year?
Okay, well, I have an eBay account where I sell. I'm kidding. I don't. We will give them to anybody who wants them, really. Anybody that's going to use them correctly, we're happy to give them. We'll even come out and advise parish councils, town councils, people outside our area, anywhere up and down the council, anywhere up and down, anywhere really in the UK. We'll come out and help them place them in the right places where they're going to get the most success. Anybody that wants their own logos on them will need to go to the printers that we used, and we can give people details of that. But if they're happy to have our logos on, we'll send them out. We're hoping to do next year to just send them out to some quite famous landscapes, just to see if we can get them put maybe at Buckingham Palace, and some really interesting landscapes that might not have had them before. So we're gonna do a bit of a post next year and see where we can get them installed.
I think if royalty take it up, you might have to do a bit of a reprint of some of those. They've got quite a bit of land.
Yeah.
So
Well, they do. I did go to Buckingham Palace once, and in her garden she has got long grass and rewilded areas. She specifically leaves areas at Buckingham Palace private gardens for the bees. So she's halfway there already.
Brilliant. And of course, Queen's Green Canopy, which were alongside many others are supporting again, and the 3 trees that were planted earlier as part of that. So yeah, all playing our part right across the country with that particular agenda. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back now to Councillor Pentland, but thank you for engaging in the questions that were posed this afternoon.
Thank you, George, and thank you for everybody for engaging with that final Q&A session of the day. So I'm going to go to some closing remarks now, and just to say what a thought-provoking and engaging day we've had, looking at some of the work going on locally in tackling climate change and protecting our beautiful natural environment. At this point, I want to reiterate my thanks to all those that have been involved today, in particular the speakers who've kindly given their time to provide really interesting talks on the work locally. And it's been fascinating to find out more about this, as well as providing a space for us to reflect on what climate change means for us here in North Northamptonshire and on the broader scale. I am really pleased that people from across North Northamptonshire will have had the opportunity to engage with the innovative work going on their doorstep, with projects spanning from Kettering up to the top end of East Northamptonshire. As well as hearing about the work in the private sector, industry and community groups, you've heard today about some of the things your council, North Northamptonshire Council, is doing in respect of playing our part in tackling climate change. But this is, of course, not all we're doing, and all parts of the council are working on the various parts of our response, from tree planting, as we've seen today, to electric vehicle charging, cycling and walking infrastructure, to the council's own journey to carbon neutrality. Indeed, part of shaping our response involves our climate change, environment and growth panel, which is meeting tomorrow morning on Zoom to discuss matters including the council's route map to delivering on tackling climate change. And I'd encourage local people to engage with us as part of this, and there are a wide range of ways you can do so. For example, by engaging with our council meetings, and this today is another example of that. And I know George has mentioned in earlier sessions that we're going to be posting further responses to questions we've had in about what the council is doing on the council's website. I'd also like to impress to people that we do know there is a lot of work to be done, and we're not resting on our laurels in doing so, but it is a large undertaking and we're well aware of that. One of the key goals of COP26 was working together to deliver. And I hope that the talks today demonstrate how we can do that for the good of the planet that we rely on. COP26 allowed us to look at the macro picture in terms of global contribution toward climate change and changing the direction on this. NNClimate21, our conference today, has allowed us to look closer to home at our own locality. And I hope that from the speakers you've listened to today, you'll agree there is a further level to be looked at, with that being what we as individuals are doing. Turning the tide on climate change is a big challenge. That's undeniable, as we've heard from the speakers today. But in doing so, the role of nations, local areas and individuals have to play are of equal importance, in the same way that ecosystems function because of the role each part plays. So in concluding, we're all clear that the time to act is now if we're to turn the tide on climate change, and we all have a role to play, something on which we mustn't delay. Our planet gives us life, and whilst in day-to-day life we may take this for granted, it is within our hands to ensure that this unique life-giving ability of the planet can continue into the future. So thank you everybody for engaging today. I hope that you found this to be interesting and useful, and really appreciate everybody's time.